Again, I always say my problem is Bob. Okay, so let's get started. Today, it's really, really interesting. It's a chapter in the book. It's right really after the 12 steps, after you go through the 12 steps. And because the last step is working with others, and it talks about that in step 12, in all our affairs, working with other alcoholics or compulsive overeaters or anybody in life, right? It could be anyone. And the chapter is two wives. Okay, that's the next chapter. So for some reason, it's like, some people say, well, they did the steps in the first part of the book, the first 103 pages. Some people go, it's interesting. Some people go by the first 88 pages because those are where the steps are. And then some go to 103. And of course, a lot of people say the first 167 pages were never changed. And that's where they get all the recovery in. So the chapter to wives, it's also known as, a lot of people call it the codependency or Al-Anon chapter, because after all, it was written for women whose husbands were alcoholics. Back then it was considered that only the men, of course, we know differently today, were alcoholics. So the whole thing was catered towards men. So this chapter, again, could be the codependence or Al-Anon chapter. Also, I related to step 4. A lot to do with step 4 when we read. But, this chapter here, this is what's really interesting about it. This chapter, which a lot of people may not read, is the practical to me. Of course, the family afterwards and 2 employers, which come after this, are also, but this chapter to me is the whole practical application of the program. So here we have an opportunity to practice the whole program. And even when I read the first sentence on the first page, on page 104, in Two Wives, the first exact page, and the first thing I came across that I have underlined is, among us are wives, relatives, and friends in whom the problem had been solved. So the question is that it tells us everything in this, even this one sentence here tells us the whole story, because how many times have we talked about, and in the book it says in many places, to answer to all our problems. It says that on page 15 in Bill's story, and throughout it just says the answer to our problems, all our problems and all our situations and all our, in life. And the 9th and 10th step promises talks about that, as well as some who have not yet found a happy solution. So anybody here who is not happy, joyous, and free, I mean, not that any of us really are all the time, but we have a solution now. We can go back and become that way, even if something bothers us. So it says, even if you have not yet found the solution, even if you've done the steps, this chapter could be really, really life-changing and eye-opening and change your whole thinking. Because again, we can intellectualize and read, but this is the practical application. And who could be more desperate? They talk, and you'll see in this chapter, than to the wives of alcoholics or to the husband of alcoholics. I mean, what's the difference, right? As we know today, it could be the same. It's the same exact thing. But also, it's not only to the people, our spouses who are alcoholics, or people in our family, but this whole chapter here is life-changing in that it's relationship to all people in every situation. And that's, I relate it to step 4, because step 4, the main thing it says is resentment. Oh, that brings me to remember what the topic is. The inventory is ours. Again, just the topic alone, the inventory is ours, should ring a bell if you've been doing the steps in this program. If you've done a step 4, the inventory is ours. So here in this chapter, it's directly related to that. Also, as reference, you could go to in the AA 12 and 12, the 4th step, go through there. And also there are some things I'll be referring to in the big book that have everything to do with this chapter. But anyway, because it says in the next, on that, in the middle of page 104, in the 3rd paragraph, at the last sentence says, what they say will apply to nearly everyone bound by ties of blood or affection to an alcoholic. Okay. But we could put in there, as we do many times, tied to blood or affection to everyone in our lives. So here's an extreme example of a situation which these wives had to contend with, and how they contended with it is right here, and their solution. and working these steps in this program. So again, this is the codependency Al-Anon program. And again, when we're codependent, we're totally in prison. We're enslaved. We're letting people dictate how we're going to feel one day or how we're going to run our lives. And as we read here, we'll see how this whole chapter shows us how to, in any difficult situation, to how to resolve our problems. And most of it is due to a relationship with people. So if you're having problems with your marriage, with your spouses, with your children, or any of those other things, your boss at work or your friends, this to me, when I read it, tells me the answer and the solution. Along with as we go back, we'll review different things where these things come from in the steps. Again, it's all about the steps and letting go and a higher power and God and all of that. It's all related to the steps in our program. But so let me go on here. It says, and this is, again, it tells us here, this book really, the truth is here. I've seen people recover and have whole transformations because on the next paragraph in the second sentence says, we want to leave you with the feeling that no, it says the word no here, no situation is too difficult, no unhappiness too great to overcome. Wow. So it's saying again, no situation. Okay, anybody here who's in situations and is unhappy, it's saying here, and believe me, it's true, because when people go through this work and do this first part of the book, again, this is so important. You did the steps already, but right here, we're going to do the practical application of the steps in Two Wives on page 104. No unhappiness too great to overcome. So already it's telling us that we're going to have a solution to everything. We're going to be happy. And there's no situation. And it's going to tell us here how to do it. It's again, the instruction book. And it goes on to say, we've had long rendezvous with hurt pride, right? What does that have to do? The self-centered fear, ego, right? Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, right? Frustration, self-pity. Again, the self, page 62 talks about self-pity, our self-centered fear. Misunderstanding, our delusions and illusions. Page 62 talks about the illusions of the mind, how we can't interpret anything when we come from the self. And fear. It's all based on self-centered fear. The evil and corroding thread through our lives is fear. So here we're going to find out. Now it's telling us the problem, but it's also saying here on page 104, the first page alone, telling us there is a solution to our problem. We have become, and this goes on the top of 105, driven to maudlin sympathy, to bitter resentment. Okay. Now on page 552, on page 52, they talk about the bedevilments. In other places of the book, in Bill's story, he was in quicksand, and it talks about how we get into our self-centered fear. We're at the jumping off point, depression, anxious, whatever it is. So some of us veered from extreme to extreme, ever hoping that one day our loved ones would be themselves once more. So expectations are resentments ready to happen. This is so important here. What is it teaching us here? It's saying that our loved ones would themselves become themselves once more. Ever hoping that if the other person would change, again, it talks about this in being a director of the play, wanting to control things on page 60 and 61. Like Shakespeare, the director of the play, if only everybody else would behave, then I would be happy. So our happiness here is telling us what? Dependent on other people. It could be our children, a spouse. It could be somebody at work, somebody we meet, a stranger, a clerk in a store, a stranger in the street. It's all the same thing, a neighbor. So we'll go from there, and then we'll go skip over to page. Okay, go to page 107. Go to the very bottom in the last paragraph on 107. It said the second sentence, what had become of their judgment, their common sense, their willpower? Why could they not see that a drink meant room to them? So it's saying here that starting to tell us something about the person that we are upset with, that's making us miserable, that maybe we resent or we're dependent on. It's saying they don't have the judgment of self-willpower, right? But there's somebody else involved in this whole situation that's lacking the self-will and is trying to do it through self-will and willpower. And that's us. If we read the sick man prayer on 67 and 68, it says, them like ourselves are sick too. Them like ourselves are sick too. So when I always thought everybody else was the problem, I try to take, again, step 4 says the inventory is ours. We'll read about that, not the other man's. So I always try to fix somebody else, figure out why they did what they did, what the situation was. And I started to realize it had to do with me and my thinking. So they may have been spiritually bankrupt or sick, but I also had to look at myself too. They could not see that drink meant ruin to them. This is all talks about, more about alcoholism and, all, it could be with the food or the drugs. No matter what, their husbands, just like, we know how they feel because we're compulsive overeaters, alcoholics. Here's a wife who obviously didn't possibly have the addiction, but we can relate to how they're feeling because we knew we couldn't figure it out. How many times did we devastate our bodies, our minds with alcohol, drugs, and food? So, but the wives' problem they had, and what they're addressing here, is their codependence. So, in a way, that was the addiction, that was the compulsion, right? So this is what's amazing about it, but they're resolving this through, luckily, right? We always hear the phrase, we're grateful alcoholics, or grateful compulsive overeaters. So, as we're finding out, in a lot of these cases, they're grateful, okay, that their husbands were that way. And they find out that they could have the spiritual awakening through this program and steps also. It's interesting. Most of us here had these addictions and problems, and we could say, well, we were not like normal people. But I've seen so many people who work this program, work these steps, and what happens is when they have the transformation, yeah, there are people who go through life normally all the time, but having had that spiritual awakening, a lot of them are still in the world. And what I mean by that is they're always still, even though they're not going crazy over everything and their life seems to be pretty stable, they still feel that people should like them, love them, they should be achieving in life. But when we work these steps, because we had this deficiency mentally towards our addiction, we should be grateful that we have this spirituality that we can. And in many cases, I mean, when I observe people who I always thought and they're so-called normal, and maybe don't have to go to a 12-step program, but they're just still lacking that spirituality that I see in people here. So when we confront the problem through spirituality, we have a solution and answer. And a lot of times I see them struggling. And the way I mean by struggling, they're still trying to be better, to get more achievement in life, and to relate their emotional feelings, not as much as we did in our situation, but definitely. I mean, we have the isms, we definitely have it. But it's funny how, like they say, the 90-pound weakling, the man, he went and he worked out his whole life and he became Mr. America. So what I'm saying here is that in our lives, we were like that weakling. We couldn't figure it. We were spiritually bankrupt. We were depressed. We were upset. But through these steps in this program, gratefully, we can be to a point where when we see other people in life and the way they're running around and I could tell you a story here. I worked with this a technician at a job, and so what happened was she happened to be from a very, very poor country, right? It was in this hemisphere. It was a very poor country. But when she came here, the first thing she said was that the people are running around like they are crazy. So what is she saying and what are we observing? Most of the people in our material society are crazy. It's all about achievement and money. But I'm telling you, people I know who go through these steps with their heart and do these steps in this program and read like we're reading here, their whole transformation, a spiritual transformation, you can get it through this program here, which Eastern, Western religions. Billions of people believe in religion for a certain reason, right? So a lot of these poor countries are very spiritual, right? Because they weren't corrupted by the material. They say it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, right? So we unfortunately have all of these riches and material things. So our eyes go towards the low-hanging fruit. We didn't need the spirituality. But in our case, we hit bottom gratefully with our addictions. So here the wives, okay, let me get back to this. The wives are hitting bottom also. So it says on page 108. Okay, so it says on 108, on the first paragraph in the second sentence. Perhaps your husband has been living in that strange world of alcoholism where everything is distorted and exaggerated. So in the practical applications program, it's telling us when we're into our addictions, food, whatever it is, or people, we are being distorted and exaggerated. It says on page 62, the self-centeredness, but it's also saying the illusions and delusions of our thinking. It's all related to the self. And it goes on to say in the next paragraph, try not to condemn your alcoholic husband no matter what he says or does. How powerful is that statement? What could we put in the word for the words alcoholic husband? Oh, it could definitely put alcoholic wife, but we could also put in there the neighbor, the clerk in the store, my children, right? It could be people just driving down the street, the guy who cuts me off on the highway. Try not to condemn your husband no matter what he says or does. What other people say or think is none of my business. The inventory is mine. This is part of step 4. So our codependency and our addiction to people, to other things, food, whatever it is, all the 7 deadly sins, pride, envy, jealousy, it all is related to what we think of other people. He is just another very sick, unreasonable person. Okay. Just another very sick, unreasonable person. So I had to realize that I was normal. No, I'm kidding. No, that everybody is related to the self-centered fear and it talks about in step 4 in the 12 and 12, it talks about these instincts. We have these normal instincts to want to get food, to be fearful when there's something really attacking us, like physically, right? But we self-still run riot. We misuse it. The same with our addiction to food, definitely. So here we're talking about codependency and addiction to the problem their husband has with the alcohol. He is just another very sick, unreasonable person. Treat him when you can as though he had pneumonia. Now, what is in the sick man prayer? We talked about when somebody's spiritually sick, we get resentful and upset. Why don't they know better, right? When their thinking is off. But if somebody's in a hospital with pneumonia, it's telling you here the secret. When you see somebody acting towards you like in a deleterious manner, you can just look at them like they're sick people, like they had pneumonia. So every time you have somebody trying to push your buttons and get upset with you, think of they have pneumonia or a broken leg or something. That's all. And that's the solution here. When he angers you, remember he is very, very ill. So here's the practical application, all about step 4. It's all about resentment with people. This whole program is about, and most of the ailments in our lives, the depression, the anxiety, the being upset is all related to our relationship to people. Our addictions, right? Our addictions to food, our addictions to the alcohol, the drugs, and to people is all related to this. So that transformation, in other words, the transformation here is seeing somebody as just sick. So why would we take offense? Because we could be confident that we're lucky, we're not sick, we're healthy, and they're sick. So we have to have compassion, love, and understanding. But we don't look at it that way. We look at the reverse. Oh, look what they did to me. It's all about us. They said this to me. They did this to me. So here, the wives are having all of these things done to them. Their families being ruined and all kinds of husbands not working. His husband's having maybe affairs. And here's a solution that they found, and they had to have because they were miserable themselves, or they would probably end up drinking too. So if we go on to page 111, and it says on 111, right? You got to remember, it says, what does it say in previously? It says that anger, upset is not the luxury of us alcoholics. We have this ism. That's not our luxury. We can't be upset. And it says here, the first principle of success. So it's saying here, if you want to be successful, the answer is the first principle is you should never be angry. Okay. So everybody listening here is going to say, well, it's a human emotion. We should be angry. But it's saying here that not to, when I get angry, I just want to know the truth from the false. Anytime I get angry, at least I know where the problem is. It's me and my thinking towards the other person or situation. Because I could be in a room with 10 other people and 9 of the other people have a different emotion or feeling about that same situation. They may have love and tolerance for the person where I'm getting upset and angry and self-centered and fear. So even your husband Even though your husband becomes unbearable and you have to leave him temporarily, you should, if you can, go without rancor. Patience and good temper are most necessary. Just saying, look, resentment, anger, and fear. I mean, we can get out of that. Um, our next thought is that you should never tell him what must do about his drinking. Right? We can't. We, the only thing I realized that we could change is ourselves. But interesting enough, when we change, the other people do change, and it's going to talk about that here too. But I can't tell people what to do, when to do. People will on their own do things, but the answer is that they have to find their center. I can't even tell myself what to do. But when I get centered and when I'm a higher power, God will give me the solution and the answers. And most of the time, he'll tell me, like it says here, don't tell other people what to do, right? I mean, you can't. What are you going to do? The other people are going to do what they do. If he gets the idea that you're a nag or killjoy, your chance to accomplish anything is, So here we go. When we tell other people what to do, we're really being a nag and a killjoy, right? So, um, so here, the next paragraph is really interesting. Be determined that your husband's drinking is not going to spoil your relationships with your children or your friends. So, no matter what our situations, they're telling the wives here, and we're working this program for all of us. No matter what's going on in our situation, we could be happy, joyous, and free, right? Okay. It is possible to have a full and useful life, though your husband continues to drink. We know women who are unafraid, even happy under these conditions. So, under these conditions, all our problems, no matter uh, all kinds of difficulty and being upset in life, we could still be happy. It's telling us here in this paragraph, in this chapter. Okay, just go on to on page 116. Okay, on the second paragraph down, we have elsewhere remarked how much better life is when lived on a spiritual plane. So this step 12, 7, having had step 12 says, having had that spiritual awakening, it's telling us here, if we get spiritual and not in the material and the world, the human world, in its little plans and designs and the material things and the money, success, and resentment, anger, jealousy, envy, if we become spiritual. And this whole program, this is the whole program, why I said it's a practical application. We can have that spiritual awakening where all these things around us, that the happiness and joy comes in here. It's not anything about outside. And that's exactly what it's saying here. If God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, he can solve your problems too, right? Again, this program, step one says we're powerless over alcohol. You could put food in there. You could put all our problems in there. So it's really telling us here, it's saying the solution. It's telling us how many times we're going to have to read this, where it's telling us if we do the spiritual program. But what we always do, and what I hear people do at times myself, when I'm miserable, irritable, and discontent, I'm trying to figure it out. I'm saying, okay, Bob, this is what you have to think. This is what you have to do. No, that's the self. The self can't do it because, my best thinking got me here. So how can I'm like the fox, guarding the chicken coop or whatever. I can't, my mind can't figure anything out. And it's been proven time and time again. But interestingly along, I talk about my mind, but we have a soul. And, I read that thing the other day where nobody can teach you anything that you don't already know. All the answers, and it talks about here, are within us. God, we were creating God's image. God, the idea of God is in every man, woman, and child, it talks about on page 55. We have this God consciousness. It's already there. But step four, and, we blocked it out with the defects of character. We wives found that, like everybody else, we were afflicted with pride, self-pity, and vanity. Wow, this is really interesting because if somebody does something to me and I get upset, I remember somebody told me once, Bob, I was at a job and the people were upsetting me and they said, Bob, you have a big ego. And I said, what do you mean I have a big ego? I'm here just trying to do my job. I'm in my little corner. I don't say much. I'm very quiet. And all of these people are carrying on and they're saying things to me. And maybe some of them pushing my button. So what does that mean I have a big ego? Right. So, you know, it's saying here that these women, here the women aren't the alcoholics, but they're telling the women who are depressed and upset, listen, you have pride, self-pity, and vanity and all the things that make up the self-centered person. It says we were afflicted with. So the solution to spiritual awakening for these women becomes, and for anybody else with us with relationships to people, when we realize we're the problem, our ego, our self-centered fear. Because when we bring God in, and it's called, next page we're going to talk about what's called the watchwords, and you'll see what I mean when we get to it. But let me finish on here. And we were not above selfishness and dishonesty. So we're being selfish, we're being dishonest because we're not seeing the truth from the false. It talks about on page 58, honesty 3 times. It's not talking about giving somebody the right change. It's talking about an honest inventory. Because when I came in, my inventory was, look what the other person did. Look at this person, look at that person. It says, I should read some of that, but we'll go on here. It says the inventory is ours. So, as our husbands began to apply spiritual principles in their lives, we began to see the desirability of doing so ourselves. What does that sentence say? That sentence is saying that somebody in your family who's acting like these husbands did, and then the wives did, when the husbands turned around, the wives turned around, right? When the wives turn around, the husbands, not in all cases. And if they don't, what do we care, right? The joy and happiness comes from within here. I can't live for somebody else and what they do in their lives. It's none of my business, but I can be happy with somebody else being upset and if they're ruining their lives, because my joy and happiness is not codependence. This is the Al-Anon chapter on people, but it's the practical application of the whole program that we have here. Okay, at next chapter. At first, some of us did not believe we needed this help. We thought on the whole we were pretty good women, capable of being nicer if our husbands stopped drinking. All right, so they're putting their dependence on the husband. They would be happier, nicer, everything would be fine. But the idea was silly. And we were too good, but we were too good to need God. They didn't need God. They needed this. What they based their life on was self-will. They were using the self. Now we try to put spiritual principles to work in every department of our lives. So anytime we're upset, irritated, or discontent, we can put these spiritual principles into our lives. Okay, that's what it's saying here. When we do that, we find it solves our problems too. Now, it uses the word plural here. So if I have a problem, it's telling me the solution. It's giving me the practical application. Okay, whatever it is, if I'm walking down the street and somebody's upsetting me or cutting me off, or I'm at work, the boss yells at me, it's all the same thing that they're telling you here. And we're going to see on page 118, we're not there yet, but it talks about what's called the watchwords. The ensuing lack of fear, worry, and hurt feelings is a wonderful thing. So, wouldn't it be great to lack fear and hurt feelings? It's all fear is all cause anxiety, depression. And we want to kill ourselves and go to the jumping off point, as it says in here. We urge you to try our program, for nothing will be so helpful to your husband as a radically changed attitude towards him, which God will show you how to have. Okay, so if we go to, so here's what I've been kept on talking about on page 118. On page 118 in the second paragraph, you see the word patience and tolerance. It's after this third sentence in this second paragraph. Patience, tolerance, understanding, and love are the watchwords. These are the watchwords. In other words, the watchwords, it comes from a saying that there's a watchman, right? So when there's going to be danger, the watchman yells out, hey, there's somebody coming, or they would do something about it, right? So our watchwords were patience, tolerance, understanding, and love. So when we have a problem, this is what we bring to the forefront: patience, tolerance, understanding, and love. Show him these things in yourself, and they will be reflected back to you from him. Again, it's telling us here, if we want to change the world around us, and if we change and we have, I always say the best way to get even with somebody is to love them. When we when we don't resist people, and it says in a 10-step promises, when we stop fighting anything or anyone, when we stop doing that, right? That's what happens in the 10. That's a promise. And it's also saying here, the world, when my thinking changes, there's an expression, the world around me changes, right? And also there's an expression, change me and bless them. So if I change me and bless them, would have a blessing for them and pray for them, they'll change. But if they don't, that's none of my concern either. I could go be happy. It's not going to depend on other people or other things, right? Um, if you both show a willingness to remedy your own defects, there will be little need to criticize each other. We so everything that we've talked about, and a lot of the stuff and all of the different things is related to this dependence upon a God, a higher power, not upon people. If you go to, let me just do a couple of things and then we'll do the sharing. But on page 99, it explains it throughout this book, but just a few pages I just want to hit upon quickly. The last sentence on page 99, this says it again. We're going to hear this a million times, a million times and go in one ear and out the other. We're going to try to analyze intellectually. But right now, we could bring it in. When you read this, let's bring it into here, into our hearts. Remind the prospect that his recovery, again, remember this, your recovery is not dependent upon people. It is dependent upon his relationship with God. We have seen men get well whose families have not returned at all. So here are the men who are alcoholics, and it could be women or men, whatever, but then it was all they emphasized with men, and they lost their jobs, they lost their families, they lost all their money. But it's saying that their happiness doesn't come from that, because again, some guy with a big family with $1 billion with a huge house is very miserable and depressed, right? So the answer is a spiritual solution, but it's for us alcoholics, compulsive overeater, and addicted people, but it's to everybody in life. Like I said, so-called normal people that I run into, now that I'm in the program and I have the spiritual awakening, my life has changed tremendously as far as the thinking and in relation to what I see and what they're doing. So it's all related to the same thing. Um, so we could see as we go on here, and just the next paragraph, it says, um, both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. The reason this paragraph, and since we're here, I'll just say the reason it says you and the new man, it's telling us the new person coming in, we're sponsoring them. But how about the old man? What I mean by that, how about a person who's been in the program 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? These people. Are they, are we at times, myself, I'll speak for, working in the path of spiritual progress? Am I doing self-will? Am I bringing a higher power of God's will into my life, right? So both you and the new man must walk day by day in this path of spiritual progress. If you persist, remarkable things will happen. When we look back, we realize the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were much better than anything we could have planned. So the beauty of this is I don't have to plan anything anymore. I don't have to figure out if I'm going to get a better job, if I'm going to have a good relationship with somebody. I don't have to figure out if I'm going to get even with somebody. I don't have to figure it out anymore. This is what the whole program Steps talks about. Follow the dictates of a higher power, and you will presently live in a new and wonderful world, no matter what your present circumstances. So if somebody's here, if you're upset, depressed about something, something's nagging you, bothering you, woke up and you're in self-centered fear, a wonderful world. We could be in a wonderful world, realizing the truth. It talks about the inventories being honest. It's not we relate everything to ourselves. It's not about us. That's false. Anytime we have a fear or a self-centered thought and fear, that's false. It's not true. The way we know that is because like I love that saying, worrying works because 95% of things I worry about never happen. But besides that, it's just not true. It's a lower level of thinking. Real joy and happiness comes from within, because when we do achieve what, say we're upset about, a job or money or a living situation or a spouse, when that change comes about, in a very short order, and I talk about the man who climbs Mount Everest, we're back into being upset and depressed again because we're putting our happiness in a momentary pleasure, it's called. This book and this spirituality is offering us a blissfulness, contentment beyond comprehension. It talks about in this book. This wonderful, what does it say here? This wonderful world, the fourth dimension, the sixth sense, rising. It talks about rising above our problems like an airplane going over the storm clouds. This is very possible, but it has to be a transformation. But when we start to figure it out, and we realize we have the power, step one says we're powerless, then we could come to no avail. And just one more thing on page 67, it just says there, and then we'll have people share. 67, it says here in like the second paragraph down, referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking? How come they have that word self in there all the time? Self-seeking, frightened. Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? Okay, we have a problem. We're the problem, and it tells us that here, because 95% of change of thinking is the answer to our problem when we have that transformation.